So let's take a look at the concept of blackness in the European mind. This is the key to helping us appreciate something about racism. Now, in Europe, skin color was associated with values, physical values, cultural values, intellectual values. And so for the British, they were extremely conscious of skin color. The first contact England will have with Africans will be in the 1550s, and they will immediately make reference to the Africans' skin color and their lack of clothing. So with this suddenness of contact, England, which was scarcely aware that Africa existed, created exaggerated perceptions of blackness and self. And so when we take a look at the concept of blackness in the European mind, blackness is loaded with meaning in European cultures. I don't care if it's Spanish, if it's Italian, if it's German, if it's Dutch, any culture coming out of Europe, blackness is loaded with meaning in the culture because black conveys the worst fears, especially of the world. Black means to be deeply stained with dirt. Black means to be soiled. Black related to death. Black related to being sinister, to being wicked. Black is not a neutral color in European circles. White, on the other hand, equals purity. White, on the other hand, equals virtue, virginity, innocence. Why don't women wear black when they get married? Okay, so today they wear tan or off-white, but black is loaded with negativity. To the British, racial differences were deeply disturbing. Racial differences in color posed and still poses an intellectual problem. So theories were developed to help understand race. And first was the environmental theory. The British figured that the sun and its heat and its exposure to the sun produced the darker skin. So it was logical to understand why native peoples, Africans, and Asians had darker skin to Europeans. But problems with this theory developed because the Africans, the Asians, and the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere who were taken to live in England didn't lose their skin color. So a religious theory was developed. England looked to the Bible for justification of slavery and blackness. And you have many, many fundamentalist preachers still adhering to this particular theory, the religious theory. It was God's treatment of Ham. God's treatment of Ham and his son perhaps provided the clue as to why Africans were, quote unquote, the servant of servants. Ham was cursed to being a servant. So the British applied this curse to the African and associated the curse with blackness. But a problem developed. There is nothing in the Bible relating to skin color. Basically, the English had an attitude towards the color black that leads scholars to understand why they read blackness into the curse. But blackness was also associated with other negative images. Blackness was related to being subhuman. Blackness was related to having animal-like qualities. When the British viewed African cultural expressions, they immediately wrote negatively on the non-Christian quality of African religion. To them, this was a sign of a lack of civility, but was really abhorrent to the European pious Christian tradition were the polysemous expressions that were invoked during African religious rituals. These body movements, and then of course the minimal clothing, indicated to the European that Africans had loose sexuality. So with no sufficient dress, with nakedness, and with severe body movements, Africans were seen as sexual and lustful. And this sex and this lustfulness was tied to animal-like movements. And they related Africans to the images of apes. Apes became known to the English as the same time as Africans, hence the link. Now we have all become familiar with the story of Tarzan, but what we must come to terms with is the image of King Kong. This is the racist image that keeps reappearing every generation so as to send a subliminal message. The original King Kong movie appeared at a time of heightened racial tension as African Americans began moving out of the South and into northern cities. The fear of the black man, especially the black man with a white woman, has perplexed American society. Hence the King Kong image, the fear of this beast devouring an innocent white virgin, especially a white woman. This combination of negative perceptions was in the culture prior to the English turning to slavery as the solution to the formation and control of labor forces in the Chesapeake region. So what happened to Africans before slavery officially began in Virginia? What happened to Africans before slavery officially began in the Chesapeake? Well, 1619 is the first year that Africans appear in Virginia. And the evidence suggests that Africans were treated worse than white indentured servants prior to slavery. By 1640, the evidence indicates that slavery entered Virginia. Because in Virginia, in 1640, there are some free Africans and some enslaved ones. However, there are no enslaved whites. Now, there is a case in 1640 in Virginia of 3 runaway servants. 2 were whites, and 1 was African. The white servitude was extended for 3 years, while the Africans was extended for life. And by 1650, the first slave laws are going to be introduced. There were more black women than white women working the fields. And why? Because African women were preferred because of their agricultural expertise. And it was common in the Chesapeake to tax all male workers as part of revenue raising. The tax law was extended to all African female workers. And the law also set up a requirement forbidding the enlistment of Africans to colonial militias. Colonial administrators did not like the idea of a black man with a gun. And this is part of the fear of Africans in the English cultural tradition. So let's take a look at a film clip from the History Channel that addresses the origins of slavery.
In 1619, Virginia was an isolated British settlement on the Chesapeake Bay, sparsely populated by men trying to make the colony profitable for England. But the colonists were devastated by hunger, disease, and raids by Native Americans. So when the White Lion, a badly damaged Dutch slave ship, arrived carrying 20 kidnapped Africans, the colonists bartered food and services for the human cargo. The colonists had no model for slavery. The Africans joined poor white Europeans as indentured servants. They would earn land and freedom in exchange for 7 years of hard labor. The colonies prospered, and as exports grew more profitable, the colonists were reluctant to lose their labor. Unlike their European counterparts who held citizenship in their home countries, Africans were not subject to English common law. They were workers without rights. In 1641, slavery was legalized. Africans became chattel, personal property that could be owned for life. Slave labor enabled the colonies to become so profitable that in 1660, England's King Charles II established the Royal African Company to transport humans they called black gold from Africa to the Americas. When England finally outlawed its slave trade in 1807, America relied on its own internal slave trade. By 1860, 1 million humans were being moved and sold in the colonies. Families were torn apart. Traders marched their chattel from the East Coast to the southern plantations. Along the way, slaves were herded like animals into crowded pens, yards, and warehouses. Traders and owners wanted a self-reproducing labor force, and the labels they used reflect the degradations of slavery. Bucks and breeding winches were sold at auction, along with prime hands to work the fields and fancy girls, graceful, light-skinned women who were sold into prostitution or to be mistresses to their masters. The enslaved population was controlled by legally authorized violence, whippings and public floggings. Owners were fined if they did not punish recaptured runaway slaves. But slavery had always had its critics in America. As the slave trade grew, so did opposition, and eventually America became a country divided against itself.